The war in the Mediterranean was meant to be a showcase of Allied unity, a perfectly oiled machine of cooperation between the two greatest powers on Earth. Instead, it became a stage for two of history's most volatile egos, General George S. Patton and General Bernard Montgomery, to tear that unity apart. By July 1943, Operation Husky was no longer just a mission to liberate Sicily from Axis control. It was a high-stakes, cutthroat race for glory. As the U.S. 7th Army and the British 8th Army carved their way through the rugged, sun-drenched Italian landscape, they weren't just fighting the hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht. They were actively sabotaging each other's operational success. Was Winston Churchill's calculated refusal to mediate the friction between Patton and Montgomery a stroke of strategic genius to accelerate the war, or a reckless, ego-driven gamble that allowed the German army to escape the trap of Sicily entirely? Long before the first boots hit the sand, the theater of operations was already fractured by political ambition. The tension was born in the smoke-filled, high-stakes meetings of the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, where the grand strategy for the Western Allies was hammered out over maps and expensive cigars. American generals, led by the pragmatic General George C. Marshall, were singularly focused on the big picture, a direct, decisive cross-channel invasion of northern France to strike the German center of gravity and end the war as quickly as possible. But Winston Churchill was a man who played a much deeper, more complex game. He fought tooth and nail for the soft underbelly approach, arguing that the Mediterranean was the key to victory. For Churchill, this wasn't just military logic. It was a desperate, calculated fight to keep the British Empire relevant in a war increasingly dominated by American industrial might and American blood. He needed a win, a decisive and public victory, to justify this Mediterranean detour to a skeptical Roosevelt and to ensure Britain remained a senior partner in the post-war world. To manage this complex and often brittle coalition, Eisenhower was handed the supreme command, but the ground forces were split down the middle in a move designed to satisfy national pride. Sir Harold Alexander, the commander of the 15th Army Group, was tasked with herding two of the most difficult, stubborn, and brilliant personalities in the entire war: General Sir Bernard Montgomery and Lieutenant General George S. Patton. This was the first time in the Second World War that two national armies, the British 8th and the American 7th, would land on adjacent fronts as co-equal forces. On a chalkboard in a quiet planning room, it looked like a coalition masterpiece. In the harsh, chaotic reality of the Mediterranean, it was a ticking time bomb. Patton, a man burning with a need to wash away the stinging, public shame of the Kasserine Pass debacle, saw Sicily as the ultimate redemption for the American soldier. He needed this win for his country, but more importantly, he needed it for his own legacy. Montgomery, the man who had stopped Rommel at El Alamein, carried a level of self-assurance and intellectual vanity that made him fundamentally impossible to work with. When you step back and look at how these two men operated, it's like watching two completely different wars being fought on the exact same island. Montgomery was the undisputed master of the set-piece battle. He didn't just fight, he engineered outcomes. He was cautious, methodical, and obsessively granular about having every single artillery shell, every gallon of fuel, and every ration accounted for before moving a single kilometer. He viewed risk as an enemy to be eliminated through overwhelming logistical superiority. Patton, on the other hand, was the cavalry officer reborn in the Age of Steel. He didn't have time for rigid, centralized planning. He prioritized tempo, momentum, and the aggressive exploitation of any weakness he could find in the enemy line. If Montgomery was a chess player meticulously calculating every move 3 steps ahead, Patton was the hurricane tearing the board apart just to see what would happen. The initial invasion plan, heavily influenced by Montgomery's preference for safe geography, felt like a deliberate insult to the American officers. Patton's 7th Army was assigned to a secondary role, basically acting as a flank guard for Montgomery's main show along the coast. Patton wasn't a man designed to sit on the sidelines, and the moment he stepped onto the beaches at Gela, he was already looking for a way to break his chains. He didn't come to Sicily to act as a buffer for the British. He came to win the war on his own terms and prove that the American military had arrived as a world-class fighting force. The logistical pressure was immediate. Operation Husky required the coordination of over 160,000 men, thousands of vehicles, and a massive supply chain in one of the most rugged, unforgiving terrains in the Mediterranean. Yet instead of focusing on the enemy, the commanders were focusing on each other. The friction turned into open chaos when Montgomery's methodical push toward Catania hit a brick wall known as the Hermann-Göring Division and Kampfgruppe Schmalz. His advance stalled, the carefully constructed momentum evaporated, and his set-piece battle transformed into a bloody, predictable stalemate. Instead of initiating a coordinated joint maneuver with the Americans, Montgomery made a unilateral decision on July 12th that effectively declared war on his own allies. He pivoted his XXX Corps inland toward Enna without telling Patton a word. He was carving his own path right through the heart of the American operational zone, completely ignoring the agreed-upon boundaries. When Alexander formally handed Highway 124 over to the British the very next day, the American command structure finally exploded. Omar Bradley, the commander of the U.S. Second Corps, was forced to halt his forces in their tracks, abandon the high ground they had fought and bled to take, and pull his troops back just to get out of the way of the British advance. Bradley, usually a man of calm deliberation, did not hold back, famously calling it the most arrogant, egotistical, selfish, and dangerous move in the entire history of combined operations in the Second World War. Can you imagine the frustration of those soldiers? Men who had fought for every inch of that hostile terrain were being told by a late-night directive that their efforts were secondary and that they had to pack up and leave for a rival commander. Patton's reaction wasn't just tactical, it was deeply, violently personal. In his diary on July 13th, he lashed out with a fury that is still palpable today. It is noteworthy that Alexander, the Allied commander of a British and American army, had no Americans with him. What fools we are. He felt the 7th Army was being deliberately marginalized, treated as a second-class, disposable military force by the British leadership. He realized then that if he wanted to save his own legacy and the reputation of his army, he couldn't play by the rules dictated by his rivals anymore. He had to win the race to Messina, no matter what Alexander or Montgomery thought about the proper way to fight a war. But where was the man who was supposed to be the ultimate arbiter of this chaotic conflict? Winston Churchill was watching from his desk in London, and strangely, he liked what he saw. He didn't want to break up the fight. He wanted to lean into it. He had already sent a blistering, acid-laced message to his own chiefs of staff in April, accusing them of pusillanimous and defeatist doctrines because they weren't being aggressive enough with the Axis forces. He knew that this rivalry, as toxic and dangerous as it was for coalition unity, was squeezing the pace of the campaign. If they were fighting each other to be the first into Messina, they were also fighting the Germans harder than they ever would have under a purely unified, cautious command. Churchill knew that momentum was the only currency that mattered in the Mediterranean. Patton didn't waste a second. On July 14th, he bullied Alexander into granting him a new independent mission, clearing the west of Sicily. He was now officially off the leash, and he aimed for the capital city of Palermo like it was the only city on the map. When he captured it on July 22nd, it was a massive high-publicity win that allowed him to pivot the entire 7th Army eastward along the northern coast. He wasn't guarding flanks for the British anymore. He was on a high-speed, aggressive collision course with the 8th Army, aiming straight for the heart of Messina. The hatred between these men was palpable. Patton's private diary entries from this period are legendary for their bluntness. He once fumed to his staff that Montgomery should "stay out of my way or I'll drive those krauts right up his ass." Yet, even in the middle of his rage, there was a strange, begrudging professional respect. He wrote that Montgomery was wonderfully conceited, but also the best soldier, or so it seems, I have met in this war. It's a fascinating, complex paradox. Patton wanted to destroy Montgomery's professional standing and outdo him at every turn, but he couldn't deny the man's undeniable competence on a battlefield. Meanwhile, Montgomery wasn't playing nice either. In a private, scathing letter to the War Office, he gave his honest opinion of the men Patton commanded. The real trouble with the Americans is that the soldiers won't fight. They haven't got the light of battle in their eyes. He blamed this lack of fighting spirit directly on their leadership, a stinging, direct shot at Patton's style of command. With two commanders who viewed each other with such profound, deeply ingrained contempt, is it any wonder the coordination fell apart? They weren't just fighting the Germans. They were constantly looking over their shoulders to see what the other guy was doing, treating the campaign like a zero-sum game. And as they raced, the terrain itself became an enemy they weren't fully prepared for. Sicily is a complex maze of mountains and narrow coastal corridors, perfect for a defensive force that knows how to leverage them. The German 14th Panzer Corps wasn't just sitting there. They were masters of the fighting withdrawal, pulling back while making the Allies pay for every kilometer of progress. Because Patton and Montgomery were so completely obsessed with beating each other to the finish line, they weren't building a unified blocking wall to trap the enemy. They were fighting two completely separate wars, and the Germans were the only ones who knew how to exploit the growing gap between them. Resources that should have been used to tighten the noose around the enemy were instead being burned on this competitive, ego-driven race. It was an operational nightmare from the start. Every truck, every precious gallon of fuel, and every air sortie diverted to support this sprint was one less resource applied to closing the trap. The Allies were creating a massive strategic bottleneck, and they didn't even realize the magnitude of the mistake until it was far too late. The stage is now set for the final, chaotic act of this tragedy. Patton's 7th Army is pushing their men to the absolute breaking point, while Montgomery remains locked in his methodical, slow grind, totally convinced that his brilliance will secure the win. But as the 7th Army nears Messina, they are about to discover a brutal lesson about what happens when you prioritize rivalry over a unified strategic plan. The enemy is already moving behind the scenes, and the trap is about to spring open. If the Allies win the race to Messina, what kind of victory will it actually be? And at what price to the entire war effort? The race for Messina had reached a fever pitch, but as the dust kicked up by Patton's tanks settled over the coastal roads, a grim reality began to dawn on the Allied Supreme Command. The rivalry that Winston Churchill had quietly encouraged as a catalyst for speed was about to produce one of the most glaring strategic failures of the Mediterranean theater. While Patton and Montgomery were locked in an intense psychological duel over who would claim the credit for liberating the island, the German forces under General Hans Valentin Hube were quietly exploiting this lack of operational coordination. They were preparing to pull off a logistical miracle right under the noses of the two most celebrated Allied generals of the war. To understand the sheer magnitude of the impending disaster, one must look at the geography of the escape route. The Straits of Messina, separating Sicily from the toe of the Italian mainland, are a mere 3 kilometers wide at their narrowest point. For weeks, the German High Command had recognized that Sicily was a losing proposition. Under the brilliant, ruthless direction of Colonel Ernst Günther Bade, the Axis forces had constructed a formidable defensive umbrella over the straits. They deployed over 500 anti-aircraft guns, creating one of the most densely packed air defense zones in the entire world. This wall of flak was designed with a single purpose: to keep the Allied air forces and navies at bay while the German army executed a clean break. Meanwhile, on the northern coast, Patton was driving his men with a ferocity that bordered on desperation. He was terrified that Montgomery would break through the eastern bottleneck and steal the headlines. To accelerate his advance along the narrow mountain-hemmed Highway 113, Patton ordered a series of risky, ad hoc amphibious landings behind German lines. The first of these at San Fratello was executed with textbook precision, but the subsequent landings at Brolo showcased the dangerous side of his obsession with speed. American infantrymen were thrown onto hostile beaches with minimal preparation, taking heavy casualties just to shave a few hours off the timetable. Back in the eastern sector, Montgomery's 8th Army was still stubbornly slamming its head against the heavily fortified Etna line. The British general's rigid adherence to his methodical doctrine was proving disastrous in the rugged, volcanic terrain. Every time Montgomery paused to regroup, mass his artillery, and replenish his supply dumps, the German forces holding the line simply fell back to the next pre-prepared ridge, leaving behind a trail of blown bridges, mined roads, and deadly booby traps. Montgomery was fighting a textbook campaign, but the enemy had already rewritten the book. The tragic irony of Operation Husky was that while Patton and Montgomery were burning through men, fuel, and ammunition to gain a few miles of rugged terrain, the real battle was being completely ignored. Neither commander had allocated significant resources to interdict the evacuation beaches. General Alexander, trapped in his role as a diplomatic mediator rather than an aggressive operational commander, failed to issue a definitive joint directive to block the straits. The Allied air forces, under separate and fiercely independent commands, were too busy bombing strategic targets deep in Italy to focus on the tactical target right in front of them, the ferries crossing the straits. On August 11, 1943, General Hube officially pulled the trigger on Operation Husky, the systematic evacuation of Axis forces from Sicily. For 7 days and 7 nights, a perfectly synchronized fleet of ferries, rafts, and fishing boats plied the narrow waters between Messina and Calabria. The German organization was flawless. Soldiers marched onto the vessels in full combat gear, their discipline unshaken by weeks of heavy fighting. Even more astonishingly, they managed to save their heavy equipment, loading tanks, artillery pieces, and thousands of tons of ammunition onto makeshift vessels under the cover of their massive flak umbrella. As the evacuation reached its peak, the absolute lack of communication between the American and British armies became a fatal flaw. Patton's forces were pushing from the west, Montgomery's from the south, but they were operating like two separate nations fighting two unrelated wars. There was no shared radio network between the forward units, no joint intelligence sharing, and no coordinated artillery plan to shell the evacuation ports. The Germans were effectively utilizing the empty, uncoordinated space between the two Allied giants to slip away unharmed. In London, Winston Churchill's balancing act was beginning to show its dangerous side effects. While he had achieved his political goal of keeping the Mediterranean theater active and showing the world that the British Army could fight alongside the Americans, the lack of a firm hand at the top was proving costly. Churchill's preference for fostering creative friction among his generals had backfired. By letting Patton and Montgomery run wild in their personal race, he had inadvertently sacrificed the ultimate strategic prize, the total destruction of the Axis forces in the south. By the time Patton's vanguard finally broke through the outer defenses of Messina on the night of August 16th, the city was a ghost town. The last German boat had departed just hours earlier. On the morning of August 17th, Patton personally entered the city, his uniform immaculate, ready to claim his historic prize. He had won the race, but as he stood on the shoreline, looking across the narrow straits at the Italian mainland, the victory felt incredibly hollow. Just a few hours later, Montgomery's lead elements, the vanguard of the storied Eighth Army, rolled into the southern edge of Messina. To their profound shock and embarrassment, they found American soldiers already directing traffic and lounging in the main square. Patton had staged a grand entry, complete with a marching band and newsreel cameras, deliberately rubbishing Montgomery's expectations of a shared or British-led triumph. The humiliation for the British command was absolute, and the political fallout within the coalition would echo for the rest of the war. But history does not judge a campaign by who takes the best photograph. When the final numbers for Operation Husky were tallied, the truth was devastating. The Germans had successfully evacuated over 40,000 elite combat troops, 9,600 vehicles, 47 tanks, and 94 heavy artillery pieces. The Italians had slipped away with an additional 60,000 men. These were not defeated, demoralized stragglers. These were hardened, experienced veterans who would form the backbone of the defensive lines in Italy. The very same divisions that Patton and Montgomery allowed to escape from Sicily would later bleed the Allies white at Monte Cassino Anzio and the Gothic Line. In his private reports to General Marshall, Eisenhower tried to paint the conquest of Sicily as a resounding success. And in many ways it was. The Mediterranean was now open to Allied shipping. The Italian fascist regime under Benito Mussolini had collapsed as a direct result of the invasion, and the southern flank of Europe was secure. But in the quiet corners of his headquarters, Eisenhower knew that the command friction between his top generals had robbed him of a decisive, war-ending blow. He realized that for the upcoming invasion of France, Operation Overlord, he could no longer tolerate a loose, uncoordinated command structure. The legacy of the command friction in Sicily left deep, unhealed wounds. Patton's aggressive, uncompromising style had won him the race, but his toxic temperament had also led to the infamous slapping incidents in the field hospitals, which nearly destroyed his career and forced Eisenhower to bench him for months. Montgomery left Sicily convinced more than ever of his own infallibility, a dangerous mindset that would lead directly to the overconfidence and operational flaws of Operation Market Garden a year later. Ultimately, the command friction in Sicily serves as a profound historical lesson in the limits of competition. While rivalry can drive men to push past the limits of human endurance, it can also blind them to the larger strategic objective. Patton and Montgomery were so intent on winning the race against each other that they forgot they were supposed to be winning the war together. And as the Allied armies prepared to cross the sea into Italy, they did so knowing that the veteran enemy divisions waiting for them on the mainland were the very same ones they had had in their grasp, only to let them slip away into the Sicilian night. Was the rivalry between Patton and Montgomery the primary reason for the German escape? Or was the failure to block the Straits of Messina an unavoidable consequence of the terrain and lack of naval air superiority? Let us know your perspective in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.